Let me tell you something strange about a person who gives up on life. We live in a world that treats surrender like weakness, that says resilience is everything, that survival is proof of character. Yet some people quietly step away, not always from breathing, but from hoping, from trying, from believing tomorrow will be different. And here is the question that always lingers beneath the surface: what happened to them before they became this tired? It's easy to say they're fragile, or dramatic, or ungrateful. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the silence of someone who has given up, there is usually a history so loud it had to be muted. You see, for some people, giving up is not about laziness. It's about an exhaustion that no one saw building. They weren't always this way. Once, they were the hopeful one. The child who tried harder than everyone else. The teenager who believed if they just loved enough, achieved enough, endured enough, something would finally feel safe. But life has a way of repeating certain lessons until they imprint on the nervous system. You notice it in small things at first. They stop celebrating good news. They don't argue anymore when treated unfairly. They say it's fine with a softness that sounds practiced. From the outside, it looks like indifference. From the inside, it's often learned helplessness. Psychologists use that term to describe what happens when someone experiences pain they cannot escape. When every effort to change their circumstances fails. Eventually, the body learns a quiet equation: nothing I do matters. And here's what's heartbreaking. This belief is rarely born from one catastrophic moment. It's layered, repeated, reinforced. Maybe it was a childhood where love was conditional, where achievement earned attention, but vulnerability earned dismissal. Maybe it was years of being misunderstood, or betrayal that came from the very people who promised safety. Trauma doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like chronic invisibility. You speak and no one hears. You try and nothing shifts. You hope, and hope becomes humiliating. So slowly, the psyche adapts. It reduces expectations. It lowers desire. It detaches from outcomes. Not because it wants to die, but because it wants the pain to stop. And here is the refrain that most people miss. It's not about wanting life to end. It's about wanting suffering to end. There's a difference. But when suffering has been woven into your earliest memories, into your attachment patterns, into your very sense of self, the line between life and pain becomes blurred. Attachment theory tells us something profound. The way we are loved early on becomes the blueprint for how we experience the world. If love was unpredictable, the world feels unpredictable. If love was withdrawn, the world feels abandoning. If love was absent, the world feels indifferent. So when someone gives up on life, perhaps what they are really giving up on is the fantasy that the world will suddenly become nurturing. And maybe that feels safer than being disappointed again. But here's what's often misunderstood. People assume that someone who gives up lacks strength, yet many of them endured more than most could imagine. They survived environments that required hypervigilance. They learned to read micro-expressions. They anticipated anger before it erupted. They soothed others before soothing themselves. They became experts in adaptation. And adaptation, when overused, turns into depletion. Because when you've spent your entire life managing chaos, one day your body simply says, "No more." It's not dramatic. It's biological. The nervous system can only sustain fight or flight for so long before it collapses into freeze. And freeze looks like apathy, like numbness, like giving up. But beneath that numbness, there is often grief. Grief for the childhood that wasn't safe. Grief for the relationships that never felt mutual. Grief for the version of themselves that once believed things would change. Because let's be honest, most of what we call motivation is rooted in hope, and hope is a fragile resource. When hope has been betrayed repeatedly, protecting yourself from it can feel logical. When was the last time you hoped for something deeply, and it worked out exactly as you imagined? And when was the last time it didn't? For someone who gives up, the ratio has tipped. They are not incapable of dreaming, they are tired of grieving. But here's where the paradox begins. Not everyone who gives up is at peace. Some are consumed by quiet despair. Others have simply withdrawn their participation. From the outside, both look the same: silence, detachment, absence. Yet internally, the motivations can be wildly different. Some give up because they believe they are unworthy of better. Others give up because they no longer trust the world to provide better. One is shame-based, the other is protection-based. And here's the existential layer that we rarely name. In a world that constantly says, keep going, keep grinding, keep improving, choosing to stop becomes a radical act. It's a refusal to participate in a system that equates productivity with value. But it can also become self-erasure. That's the paradox. The act meant to protect the self can slowly disconnect the self from meaning. Because meaning, at its core, often requires engagement. Viktor Frankl once wrote about the human need for meaning being as essential as air. When suffering feels meaningless, despair deepens. But when suffering is contextualized, when it serves something, it becomes bearable. So perhaps the brutal past of someone who gives up is not just pain. It's pain without narrative, pain without witness, pain that never found language. Studies on chronic stress show that prolonged adversity reshapes the brain's threat detection systems. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, the prefrontal cortex responsible for planning, and hope loses efficiency. In simple terms, the brain adapts to survive danger, not to imagine possibility. So when someone says, "I don't see the point anymore," it might not be philosophy. It might be neurobiology. Their brain has been trained to expect disappointment, and yet, sometimes, beneath all of that, there remains a flicker. Not optimism, not ambition, just awareness. Awareness that something hurts. Awareness that this isn't how they imagined life would feel. And maybe that awareness is not weakness. Maybe it's the last remaining thread of self. Sometimes the person who has given up is misunderstood as cold, or distant, or negative. But maybe their quiet isn't emptiness. Maybe it's self-preservation. Maybe they are conserving energy in a world that drained them too early. Maybe real strength isn't always loud perseverance. Maybe sometimes it's surviving long enough to admit you're tired. There's something sacred about that honesty. To say, "I can't keep pretending," to say, "I'm exhausted," to say nothing at all because words feel insufficient. In a culture that worships relentless positivity, despair becomes taboo. But despair, too, is human. And being human was never meant to be a performance. So the next time you encounter someone who seems to have given up, maybe send them this. Or don't, maybe just hold a quieter understanding in your chest. And if this feels uncomfortably close to home, you don't have to announce it. You don't have to fix it tonight. Maybe it's enough to recognize that giving up didn't come from nowhere. If you're struggling, please know that resources are available. Lines like the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline are there to offer support without judgment. You are not alone in this. So let's return to that first question. What happened to them before they became this tired? Maybe they loved to hide in places that couldn't hold it. Maybe they fought battles no one saw. Maybe they kept waiting for rescue that never arrived. Maybe giving up wasn't the beginning of their story. Maybe it was the last defense after trying everything else. And here is the quiet truth. Being exhausted by life doesn't mean you were weak. It might mean you were strong for too long without support. Sometimes the most brutal past isn't visible in scars. It's visible in surrender. And surrender doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes, it's just the psyche asking for a different way to survive. In the end, giving up on life is rarely about not wanting to exist. It's about not wanting to exist in pain. And maybe, just maybe, the most compassionate thing we can do is to see the pain before we judge the surrender. Because being tired doesn't mean being broken. And silence doesn't mean there's nothing left inside. Sometimes, the quietest people are simply carrying the loudest histories. Thank you for listening.